If you have been following this channel for any length of time, and if you haven't, go back and watch what you've missed, then you already know one name that comes up again and again. Jaishankar, India's External Affairs Minister. The man who has turned diplomatic press conferences into something that the world didn't know it needed. Pure, unscripted, intellectually devastating honesty. We covered the time he shut down a Western journalist who asked a loaded question about India's relationship with Russia. And the reply was so precise, so calm, so utterly unapologetic that the clip went viral across continents. We covered the time he explained to a room full of European policymakers why India refuses to see the world through someone else's lens, and did it with the kind of quiet confidence that made the room go completely silent. We covered his sharp, surgical responses to reporters who assumed India would simply fall in line behind Western foreign policy consensus. His answers were not rude. They were never rude. They were something far more unsettling to those who received them. They were right, completely, demonstrably, historically right. A leader who says what he actually means, and means every word. Real quick before we dive deeper, I just want to say, you guys have shown so much love to this channel. Genuinely appreciate it. And if you're new or haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button so we can keep making more of these videos. So here we are again, because Jaishankar has done it again. This time, the setting is the Raisina Dialogue, India's most prestigious annual geopolitical conference, held in New Delhi. One of the most important gatherings of international strategic thinkers, foreign ministers, naval commanders, and policy architects anywhere in the world. The room was full, the stakes were high, and Jaishankar walked in, calm as ever, sharp as ever, and said something that is still reverberating. But to understand what he said and why it hit the way it did, we need to understand what happened the day before he spoke. The Raisina Dialogue is not a casual gathering. The people in that room are serious. The conversations are serious. And when a senior American official takes the stage at Raisina, the whole room listens. Because what the United States says in rooms like this matters, even when people disagree with it. On this occasion, the American voice belonged to Christopher Landau, the United States Deputy Secretary of State. And Landau said something that was clearly intended to be welcoming, intended in the diplomatic language of the moment to signal American enthusiasm for India as a partner. He said the United States would not repeat the China mistake with India. Let that phrase sit for a moment. The China mistake. What Landau was referring to, in the context here is important, is the long and deeply uncomfortable story of how the Western world, led largely by the United States, spent decades economically engaging with China under the assumption that trade and integration would gradually nudge China toward a more open, cooperative, democratic direction. The theory was elegant. The reality was, to put it mildly, not what was expected. China grew enormously powerful on the back of that engagement, and then it used that power in ways that alarmed the very countries that had enabled the growth. So when Landau said America won't repeat the China mistake with India, what he was essentially saying was, America will be more careful this time, more measured, more strategic about the terms and the pace of engagement. On the surface, this sounds reasonable, maybe even flattering, an acknowledgement that India is a major partner worth thinking carefully about. But think about it from another angle. The China mistake framing implies something about how Washington sees India. It implies that India is a country to be managed, engaged with conditions, offered partnership, but partnership on terms set elsewhere, terms set in Washington. It carries within it, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps not, the assumption that America gets to decide what kind of engagement India receives and what guardrails come with it. And it implies something else too, something more subtle and more cutting. It implies that India's rise, like China's rise before it, is something that happens because America allows it to happen, because America engages with it, because the relationship with the United States is the variable that determines whether a country goes up or goes sideways. The next day, Jaishankar walked into the Raisina Dialogue, and he answered that, not directly, not by naming Landau, not by turning it into a confrontation between India and the United States, because that would have been too easy, And Jaishankar is never interested in easy. He answered it the way he always answers things, by simply telling the truth. Here is how Jaishankar answered it. He didn't walk up to the podium and say, "Yesterday, the American Deputy Secretary of State said something I disagree with." He didn't call out Landau by name. He didn't frame it as a rebuttal or a controversy. He simply made a statement about India. A clear, unambiguous, historically grounded statement about what India is, where India is going, and what determines India's trajectory. He said the direction of India's rise is very clear. He said it is, in a very real sense, unstoppable. And then he said the sentence that carries everything. The rise of India will be determined by India. It will be determined by India's strength, not by the mistakes of others. Not by the mistakes of others. That phrase and those 5 words is the answer to the China mistake remark. It is the answer to the entire framework that the remark represents. The framework that says India's rise is a function of American policy decisions, that India's trajectory is shaped by how Washington chooses to engage, that what happened with China is a template India should be aware of, and therefore implicitly a template that America will apply to managing its relationship with India differently. Jaishankar rejected that framework completely, and he did it without anger, without aggression, without the kind of theatrical confrontation that would have generated noise but diminished the message. He did it by simply asserting India's agency, India's authorship of its own story. India is not China. India's rise is not a product of American engagement, and therefore it cannot be constrained by American caution. India's growth, India's strategic depth, India's civilizational weight, these do not exist because Washington decided they could. They exist because India built them, because India invested in them, because India decided to show up as the power it actually is. The China mistake, in the American telling, was giving China too much access, too much integration, too much rope, and China ran with it in directions America didn't want. But embedded in that framing is an assumption about power that Jaishankar, with 5 simple words, simply refused to accept. The assumption that the powerful nation decides what the rising nation gets, and on what terms. India is not asking for that kind of permission. India never was. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. What is the Indian Ocean? Not on a map, but in what it once was. Centuries ago, it wasn't just a body of water or a set of trade routes. It was a living system, a monsoon-driven network of exchange connecting East Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. As described in Empires of the Monsoon, it was a world shaped by seasonal winds, where cultures, economies, and people moved in rhythm with nature. Then colonialism broke it apart. Trade was rerouted to serve Europe. Long-standing connections were severed. Borders replaced relationships. The Indian Ocean didn't just lose territory, it lost its identity. Now, as Jaishankar noted at the Raisina Dialogue, that world may be recovering, not through dramatic shifts, but through steady rebuilding. India is reconnecting eastward into Southeast Asia and westward through the Arabian Peninsula and Eurasia. This positions India not as a peripheral player, but as the hinge of the Indian Ocean world. After decades of restraint, India is stepping forward again, fully and on its own terms. Here's something that almost never gets said in foreign policy circles because it makes people uncomfortable. Most countries talk a lot about cooperation, about connectivity, about regional solidarity, about being a responsible stakeholder in the international order. And then they don't do anything. They hold conferences, they issue joint statements, they put out beautifully worded declarations that get framed on the walls of foreign ministries and slowly collect dust. Jaishankar, very pointedly, is not that kind of minister, and India in this decade has not been that kind of country. He said something in that room that diplomats rarely say in public because it is an implicit critique of how diplomacy usually operates. He said that all of this, the rebuilding of the Indian Ocean, the restoration of connectivity, the vision of a shared regional identity, requires hard work. It cannot happen through sloganeering. It cannot happen by throwing out an idea and walking away from it. It has to be backed up with resources, with real projects, with commitment on the ground. And then he started listing what India has actually done. India's work in the Indian Ocean isn't about announcements, it's about delivery. Identity systems in Sri Lanka, a functioning metro in Mauritius, hospitals in Seychelles, naval exercises, Coast Guard partnerships, training programs, and real development where people actually live. These are quiet, durable investments, not headlines, foundations. And the principle is simple. Trust is built when lives visibly improve, not through speeches or policy papers, but through results, functioning infrastructure, real support, and showing up first in a crisis. When Sri Lanka collapsed economically, India delivered the fastest, most meaningful help. When cyclones hit, Indian ships arrived within a day. This is the Indian Ocean spirit Jaishankar describes. Not rhetoric, but a track record. Much of the world sees India through great power politics, balancing the US, Russia, and China. That's real. But underneath, something more lasting is happening. India is building institutions. From the Maritime Fusion Center in Gurugram, where countries share real-time intelligence, to groupings like IORA, BIMSTEC, and the Colombo Security Conclave, India is becoming a trusted convener. Why do others participate? Because they trust India. Add to that growing partnerships, including with Australia, and a consistent presence across regional exercises, and a pattern emerges. India is the common thread in the Indian Ocean. These efforts don't make headlines, but they shape long-term influence and are steadily redefining both the region and India's role within it. And then someone asked about the Iranian warship. This is where the Raisina Dialogue conversation got complicated and human and real in a way that grand strategy discussions rarely allow themselves to be. An Iranian naval fleet had originally set out to attend a scheduled fleet review. The ships were at sea, routine, purposeful, on a planned mission. And then the geopolitical situation shifted completely beneath them. What had started as an ordinary voyage became something entirely different. The ships were caught, as Jaishankar put it, on the wrong side of events. One vessel sent a distress message. It was experiencing difficulties. At that moment, it happened to be closest to Indian waters. The request was simple: permission to enter an Indian port. India said yes. The ship came into Kochi. The sailors, many of them young cadets, people barely out of training, who had signed up for a career in the Navy and found themselves stranded in a geopolitical storm they had no hand in creating, disembarked. They were placed in a nearby facility. India took care of them. Some voices on social media immediately used this as ammunition. The argument was pointed. If India positions itself as a net security provider in the Indian Ocean, how did this happen? How did an Iranian warship end up docked in an Indian port? Isn't this India's backyard? Jaishankar's response was measured, quiet, but it carried the full weight of someone who has thought about these questions far more seriously than the people asking them on social media. He said India was guided by the humane thing to do, and then he made a broader point about the nature of the Indian Ocean that cuts through the social media noise with quiet force. The Indian Ocean has never been, in modern history, exclusively the domain of its bordering nations. Diego Garcia has hosted a foreign military presence for 5 decades. Djibouti has foreign military bases established in the first decade of this century. Hamantoda became a strategic conversation during precisely this same period. The Indian Ocean, as a physical and geopolitical space, has always had external actors operating within it. That doesn't diminish India's role. It means India's role operates within a complex, multi-actor environment, and India remains the most capable, the most trusted, the most consistently present nation within that space. But think about those young Iranian cadets for a moment. Think about what their situation actually was. Far from home, at sea, caught between geopolitical forces they had no control over, a vessel in distress, and one country opened its port. India. Not because it was required to, not because there was a treaty obligation, not because it was strategically optimal, because it was the right thing to do. Of the 3 ships in that Iranian fleet, one reached India and docked safely. One reached Sri Lanka, where a different decision was made. And one, as Jaishankar noted quietly, did not make it. He didn't linger on that last point. He moved forward. But those words, one unfortunately didn't make it, carried something in them that no amount of strategic framework can contain. A reminder that behind every geopolitical incident, every maritime development, every diplomatic calculation, there are human beings. Young people in uniform, far from home, at the mercy of decisions made far above their pay grade. India saw those people as people. That is not weakness. That is civilization. Before answering a question about India's presidency of IORA, Jaishankar paused. He said there was something he needed to raise, and then he talked about Indian merchant mariners. This was, in some ways, the most emotionally honest moment in the entire exchange, because it was the moment where geopolitics stopped being abstract and started being about actual Indian human beings, working people, invisible people, people whose names never make the front pages even when their lives are on the line. Here is the reality. Indians are one of the largest national groups working aboard the world's merchant shipping fleet. These are men and women who spend months away from their families, navigating the most dangerous waterways on Earth, carrying the cargo that keeps the global economy alive. Every tanker of oil, every container ship crossing the Arabian Sea, every vessel navigating through the Gulf of Aden, there is a very good chance that Indian hands are guiding it. And in the period when Houthi forces were conducting sustained attacks on international shipping in the Red Sea and the Northern Arabian Sea, those attacks were landing on ships with Indian crew. In the recent period, Jaishankar was speaking about Indian nationals had died, 2 tankers attacked, Indian crew members killed. He asked very quietly but with unmistakable weight whether India was paying enough attention to these people, whether the merchant mariners working in dangerous waters far from home were getting the recognition they deserve from their own country. This question was not rhetorical. It was a genuine challenge to the national conscience. Beyond the mariners, there are somewhere between 9 and 10 million Indian citizens living in the Gulf region. The stability of the Arabian Sea, the safety of those shipping lanes, is not an abstract geopolitical concern for India. It is a direct, immediate human concern. Those are Indian families on the other side of that water. Those are Indian workers whose safety and livelihoods depend on what happens in those sea lanes. And so when the Houthi attacks intensified, India did something that reflects exactly the kind of independent, principled foreign policy that defines this era of Indian diplomacy. India deployed its navy, not under the American flag, not as part of Operation Prosperity Guardian, which was the U.S.-led initiative. India chose to work independently. India coordinated with the Americans. India coordinated with European navies. India coordinated with regional maritime forces. But India did all of it on India's own terms, under India's own command, guided by India's own assessment of what was needed, because 9 to 10 million Indian citizens live over there, because Indian sailors are dying in those waters, because India's responsibility to its people does not stop at the land border. It does not stop at the 12 nautical miles of territorial sea. It follows Indian people wherever they go, into the deepest waters of the Arabian Sea, into the ports of the Gulf, onto the deck of every tanker that carries an Indian crew member standing watch under a dangerous sky. This is what it looks like when a country starts to act like the power it genuinely is. Now we return to where everything in this story begins and ends. The single most important moment in the entire Raisina Dialogue exchange, the line that brought everything into sharp, clear focus, was not a response to any specific question. It was not a rebuttal of any specific claim. It was a statement of principle that Jaishankar chose to put on the table himself. Deliberately, precisely, at the right moment. He said the rise of countries is determined by those countries themselves. He said India's rise is determined by India. He said India's rise will be determined by India's own strength, not by the mistakes of others. Now remember what had happened the day before. Christopher Landau, the United States Deputy Secretary of State, had stood at the same Raisina Dialogue and said America would not repeat the China mistake with India. The framing was friendly. The intent was, presumably, to signal American seriousness about the relationship with India. To say, we learned from what happened with China, and we will be smarter and more careful with India. But listen carefully to what that framing actually implies. It implies that America controls the pace and depth of India's rise through its engagement decisions. It implies that the critical variable in India's trajectory is what Washington chooses to do or not do. It implies that India, like China before it, is a country to be managed, strategically engaged on terms set by the more powerful party, with guardrails installed to prevent outcomes the powerful party doesn't want. This is not how a genuine partnership between equals works. And Jaishankar, who spent years as India's ambassador in Washington, who has sat across the table from American negotiators more times than most people can count, who understands the way American foreign policy thinks better than most non-Americans alive, rejected that framing entirely. He did not reject the relationship with the United States. That would be foolish, and Jaishankar is never foolish. The India-US relationship is real, important, and genuinely valuable to both countries. It is a relationship that India has invested in and that has delivered real results. But he drew a line, a clear, firm, unambiguous line, around something that is not negotiable: India's agency over its own rise. The idea that India's trajectory is a function of Indian choices, Indian investments, Indian strengths, and not a byproduct of American calculations, American mistakes, or American management decisions. This is what sovereign confidence looks like. Not bluster, not antagonism, not nationalism that mistakes volume for strength. Just the quiet, immovable insistence on the truth. India is the author of India's story, not Washington, not Beijing, not anyone else. India. There is only one ocean in the world named after a country. One. Not the American Ocean, not the Chinese Ocean, not even the British Ocean, at the height of the British Empire when the Royal Navy dominated every sea on Earth. The Indian Ocean, named after India, because the physical reality of what sits at the center of that vast body of water is so overwhelming, so geographically, historically, and civilizationally undeniable, that even centuries of colonial cartography could not erase it. Jishankar acknowledged this directly. He noted that the Indian Ocean is the only ocean in the world named after a country, and that the reasons are obvious. India sits right in the middle of it. But he added something that transforms this from a historical observation into a forward-looking statement of intent. He said India's rise is a lifting tide, not a wave that sweeps others away, not a force that reshapes everything in its path and leaves destruction in its wake. A lifting tide, the kind that raises all boats. That makes the whole ocean a better, more stable, more prosperous place for everyone who depends on it. He said that as India grows, the other countries of the Indian Ocean region stand to benefit. Those who actively work with India will obviously benefit more, but the direction of the tide lifts everyone. This is a fundamentally different understanding of power than the one that has dominated international relations for the past several centuries. The colonial powers didn't think in terms of lifting tides. They thought in terms of extraction, taking from the places they controlled and sending it home. The empires of the 19th century didn't try to make India richer. They tried to make Britain richer. What India is describing, what Jaishankar is articulating, is a vision of regional leadership rooted not in extraction, but in contribution. Not in domination, but in connection. Not in the fear that India's strength instills, but in the trust that India's track record builds. This is how the old Indian Ocean world actually worked before colonialism broke it. The empires of the monsoon were not empires of conquest in the way that European empires were. They were empires of exchange, of the seasonal rhythms of wind and water that connected people and allowed them to trade, to share, to grow together. India is trying to rebuild that. At the Raisina Dialogue, in the Fusion Center in Gurugram, in the metro system in Mauritius, in the hospital project in Seychelles, in the naval exercises with Australia, in the 24-hour disaster response when the cyclone hits. Lifting tide every single time. There's one more point from Jaishankar at the Raisina Dialogue that goes beyond strategy. It speaks to character. On UNCLOS, India has consistently urged all countries to follow international maritime law, even when it's inconvenient. And crucially, India has also accepted rulings that went against its own interests. That's rare. Most countries uphold international law when it suits them and sidestep it when it doesn't. India, on this issue, has chosen the harder path, applying the same standards to itself that it asks of others. This matters because it defines the kind of power India is becoming. Not just a country that asserts interests, but one that builds and lives by norms, even at a cost. A country whose credibility comes from consistency. That's what creates lasting influence. Not just strength, but trust. So that's all for today. If this gave you something to think about, subscribe to the channel and share it. Let's keep this conversation going.